The story of Alexander the Great and Macedonia is one of the most extraordinary journeys in human history. As we settle into this calm exploration, let us imagine drifting back more than 2,000 years, when kingdoms rose and fell across the Mediterranean world, and when one young man would set out from a relatively small land in northern Greece to conquer much of the known world. This is not a tale told with loud battles or rushing drama, but rather with the gentle rhythm of time itself, unfolding in a way that allows the mind to wander, rest, and absorb knowledge while easing into sleep. Macedonia, the land from which Alexander came, was once considered a rugged frontier. To its southern neighbors in Athens and Thebes, Macedonia seemed rustic, less refined, and distant from the classical heart of Greek civilization. Yet this kingdom, under the guidance of its kings, developed its own identity, blending traditions of the Greek city-states with influences from the Balkans and beyond. By the 4th century BCE, Macedonia was no longer a backwater but a rising force. This transformation prepared the stage for Alexander's life. The figure of Alexander the Great is surrounded by a mixture of legend and fact, remembered in the writings of historians like Arrian, Plutarch, and Curtius Rufus, but also celebrated in countless myths. He was a student of Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Yet he was also a warrior who marched tirelessly across continents. He founded cities, spread Greek culture, and encountered peoples from Egypt to India. His campaigns were swift and astonishing, but what lingers is not only the scale of his conquests, but the lasting connections he forged among different cultures. In exploring his story, it is helpful to remember the rhythm of daily life in Macedonia. The land was fertile, filled with vineyards, mountains, and rivers. The Macedonian people were horsemen and farmers, tied closely to the land. The court of the king was a center of loyalty, with nobles gathering to support the monarch, often through feasting, hunting, and military service. Within this environment, Alexander was raised, learning both the arts of war and the value of leadership. He inherited not only a throne but also a vision shaped by his father, King Philip II, who had already turned Macedonia into a dominant power in Greece. When Alexander set out after his father's death in 336 BCE, he was still a young man, only in his early 20s. Yet his ambition was vast. He did not simply inherit a kingdom, he sought to expand it beyond anything imagined before. His armies crossed the Hellespont into Asia, where they challenged the might of the Persian Empire, then the greatest power in the world. Victory followed victory, and soon Alexander's name spread from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Nile and the deserts of Persia. As we follow this journey in calm detail, we will pause to picture the landscapes he crossed: the sunlit plains of Anatolia, the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, the temples of Egypt, and the mountains of Central Asia. We will imagine the soldiers marching, the markets bustling, and the blending of cultures that gave rise to what historians later called the Hellenistic Age. This age was not only about military campaigns, but also about the spread of ideas, languages, and artistic traditions, carried on through trade routes and city foundations long after Alexander was gone. The story of Alexander is also the story of his legacy. He died young, only 32 years old, in the city of Babylon. Yet in that short life, he transformed the ancient world. His empire did not survive intact. His generals divided it into competing kingdoms, but his influence endured in every region he touched. Greek became a common language of administration and learning across vast areas. Cities he founded, like Alexandria in Egypt, became centers of knowledge and culture. The blending of Greek and Eastern traditions gave rise to new philosophies, religions, and scientific advances. As we gently drift through this narrative, we will move in careful stages, from Alexander's early life and education, to his great battles, to his encounters with other cultures, and finally to the ways in which his legacy continued to shape the centuries that followed. Each chapter will explore one part of this grand tapestry, weaving in not just the events, but also the textures of life at the time. The architecture of palaces, the sound of languages mingling in city streets, the rituals of worship, and the aspirations of peoples drawn together by conquest and exchange. This story, though filled with action in history books, becomes in our telling a soothing current guiding us across time and space. It is both vast and intimate, a reminder of how individuals and cultures are linked across centuries. And as we rest upon the threshold of Alexander's journey, we begin to understand how the legacy of Macedonia, though born in a corner of Greece, came to touch the world in ways still felt today. Now let us begin this gentle passage, where history becomes a quiet companion for the night, and where learning flows with the ease of a calm river, carrying us through the life and times of Alexander the Great and his Macedonian world. Macedonia, the homeland of Alexander the Great, lies in the northern reaches of the Greek world, where rugged mountains meet fertile valleys, and where the air carries the cool breath of the Balkans alongside the warmer currents from the Aegean Sea. It is in this setting that we must begin, for to understand Alexander, we must first understand Macedonia, the land, its traditions, and the character of its people. Unlike the city-states of southern Greece, with their crowded agoras and democratic assemblies, Macedonia developed under the guidance of kingship. This monarchy was not an absolute despotism, but a system tied closely to noble families, whose loyalty was expressed through service in war and participation in courtly life. At the center of this system was the figure of the king, surrounded by companions, known as the heteroi, men who advised, dined, and fought alongside their ruler. This structure bred a culture of loyalty and ambition, a culture in which the young Alexander would later be raised. The Macedonian people were known for their close relationship with horses, which roamed the plains in herds. Horsemanship became a marker of status, and cavalry would later form the pride of Alexander's army. At the same time, Macedonia was deeply agrarian. Fields of grain and groves of olives stretched across the land, and vineyards clung to the hillsides, producing wine that flowed freely in feasts and ceremonies. Life was anchored in the cycles of planting and harvest, yet the constant presence of tribal groups along the northern borders gave Macedonia a martial edge. Villages lived with the awareness of raids, and the defense of land was both a necessity and a tradition. The geography of Macedonia gave it a unique position. To the south lay the Greek city-states, with their established culture of philosophy, art, and politics. To the north stretched the lands of Thracians and Illyrians, rugged peoples who valued strength and kinship ties. Macedonia stood at this crossroads, absorbing influences from both. This blending gave its culture both a refinement through its connections to Greece and a toughness inherited from its northern neighbors. In the towns and palaces of Macedonia, one might have seen a life both familiar and distinct from that of Athens or Sparta. Houses were often built around courtyards, where families gathered under the shade of vines. The hearth remained central, with food prepared from grains, vegetables, and meats, and wine shared at the table. Yet unlike the civic debates of Athens, Macedonian gatherings were more likely to revolve around loyalty to the king, stories of ancestors, and plans for campaigns. Religion, too, played an important role. Like other Greeks, the Macedonians honored the gods of Olympus, Zeus, Hera, Apollo, and Athena, but they also held special reverence for local deities and heroic ancestors. The kings of Macedonia claimed descent from Heracles, the great hero of Greek legend, which provided divine legitimacy to their rule. Festivals filled the calendar, with sacrifices at temples and lively processions that tied the community together. In these moments, one can imagine Alexander as a child, watching the smoke rise from offerings to the gods, absorbing the rituals that bound his people to both the divine and the earthly. Education in Macedonia was less institutional than in Athens, where schools and tutors were common, yet noble families ensured their children were trained in the skills expected of leaders. Boys learned to ride horses, to hunt in the forests, and to wield weapons. They also learned to recite poetry, for Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were considered essential guides to courage and honor. These epics, filled with the deeds of Achilles and Odysseus, provided not only entertainment but also moral instruction. Alexander would later carry a copy of the Iliad on his campaigns, treasuring it as a compass for heroic action. The political position of Macedonia in the wider Greek world was complex. To many southern Greeks, Macedonians were considered semi-barbarians, not fully civilized in the same sense as Athens or Corinth. Their dialect, though Greek, carried a rustic accent, and their ways seemed less polished. Yet Macedonia proved time and again its ability to field powerful armies and produce strong leaders. In fact, its status as an outsider sometimes gave it advantages, for Macedonian kings could command resources and loyalty that were often fractured among the rival city-states of the south. By the time of Alexander's birth in 356 BCE, Macedonia had already begun to emerge as a major power under his father, Philip II. But long before Philip, the Macedonian kings had built a foundation of resilience. They maintained their authority not by isolation, but by engaging with their neighbors, sometimes in war, sometimes through marriage alliances, and often through trade. Timber from Macedonian forests prized for shipbuilding flowed south to the Aegean. Horses were sold to allies and enemies alike. And in return, Macedonia imported luxury goods, fine pottery, and ideas from Greece. This interchange helped weave Macedonia into the fabric of the wider Mediterranean world. One must also imagine the rhythms of daily life among ordinary Macedonians. Farmers rose with the sun, tending to fields and animals. Women oversaw households, weaving cloth, managing stores of food, and raising children. Market days brought communities together, with stalls offering produce, livestock, and crafted goods. In the evenings, families gathered around fires, sharing stories that blended myth with memory. These ordinary lives, though rarely remembered in histories, formed the backdrop against which kings and generals rose. Macedonia's origins, then, offer us a picture of a kingdom both humble and ambitious. It was a land shaped by mountains and rivers, by horses and harvests, by traditions that honored both ancestors and gods. Into this world, Alexander was born, carrying within him the heritage of a people accustomed to struggle, loyalty, and vision. As we drift from this foundation into the next chapter, we see how Macedonia, once dismissed as a rustic land, was transformed by a king whose vision prepared the way for his son's extraordinary path. Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, is often described as the true architect of Macedonia's rise. Without his foresight and ambition, the foundation upon which Alexander built his empire would not have existed. To understand Alexander's later triumphs, we must first step into the world of Philip, a man whose vision transformed Macedonia from a vulnerable kingdom into a dominant power across Greece. Philip came to the throne in 359 BCE, a time of crisis. His elder brother, King Perdiccas III, had just been killed in battle against the Illyrians, leaving the throne to Philip amid chaos. Macedonia's enemies pressed on its borders, its nobles were divided, and foreign powers, including Athens, sought to exploit its weakness. Yet within a few years, Philip stabilized the kingdom and turned its vulnerabilities into strengths. His reign marked the dawn of a new age for Macedonia, setting the stage for the extraordinary story of his son. One of Philip's most lasting achievements was his reorganization of the Macedonian army. In place of the traditional hoplite phalanx used by Greek city-states, Philip introduced innovations that made his forces both flexible and devastating. He lengthened the spears, or sarissas, to more than 5 meters, creating a forest of points that few enemies could penetrate. Soldiers drilled relentlessly to maintain cohesion, moving in perfect order across the battlefield. Alongside the infantry, Philip emphasized cavalry, especially the companion cavalry, an elite unit drawn from noble families. These horsemen became both a symbol of Macedonian strength and the hammer that struck decisive blows in battle. The army was not just a tool of war, but also a means of binding the kingdom together. Noblemen who might once have opposed the king now found honor and advancement by serving in the cavalry, while common soldiers were given land or rewards in exchange for loyalty. Philip's reforms thus created a military machine, but also a political community, uniting the kingdom around shared service. This sense of unity would pass on to Alexander, who inherited not only an army, but also a people conditioned to discipline and ambition. Philip's ambitions, however, were not confined to internal reforms. He cast his gaze southward toward the fractured world of the Greek city-states. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and others had long vied for dominance, but by the mid-4th century BCE, their strength was waning. Years of warfare, including the devastating Peloponnesian War, had drained resources and fractured alliances. Into this weakened landscape, Philip inserted Macedonia as a rising power. Through diplomacy, cunning, and force, Philip expanded Macedonian influence. He secured control over northern regions rich in timber and precious metals, giving him resources to fund campaigns. He intervened in Greek conflicts, presenting himself at times as a liberator, at other times as a conqueror. His victories against Athens and its allies eventually culminated in the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, where Macedonian forces decisively defeated a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes. The Battle of Chaeronea became a turning point. Not only did it demonstrate the superiority of Philip's military reforms, but it also positioned Macedonia as the dominant power in Greece. To consolidate this, Philip formed the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states united under Macedonian leadership. Though presented as an alliance, in reality, it gave Philip control while offering the illusion of shared governance. This league would later provide Alexander with the legitimacy to lead a pan-Greek campaign against Persia. Philip's vision extended beyond Greece. Like many Greeks of his time, he saw the Persian Empire as both a rival and a source of opportunity. Persia, though still powerful, had become vulnerable along its western territories. Philip began preparations for a grand campaign to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor and perhaps to conquer Persian lands. He had already sent advance forces eastward when in 336 BCE his life was cut short by assassination at Aegae, the ancient capital of Macedonia. Philip's death remains one of history's enduring mysteries. He was killed during the wedding celebrations of his daughter, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards. Some suggest personal grievances motivated the assassin. Others speculate about deeper conspiracies, perhaps involving rival nobles, or even Olympias, Philip's wife and mother of Alexander. Whatever the truth, the sudden death left Macedonia in a precarious state. Yet the strength of Philip's reforms ensured that the kingdom did not collapse. Instead, the throne passed to his 20-year-old son, Alexander, who inherited both the crown and the grand vision of conquest. Daily life during Philip's reign also reflected this transformation. Macedonian towns grew as trade expanded, fueled by resources from mines and forests. Roads improved, connecting villages to markets and military outposts. Aristocratic families enjoyed greater wealth, attending banquets where wine flowed and poets recited verses. At the same time, soldiers' families experienced the demands of constant campaigns, their lives shaped by the rhythms of war. Religion too adapted, with Philip patronizing sanctuaries and festivals that linked his dynasty to divine favor. His claim of descent from Heracles reinforced the notion that Macedonian kings were not only rulers, but also heirs to heroic tradition. As we reflect on Philip's life, it becomes clear that Alexander's achievements were built upon his father's foundations. Philip forged an army unlike any other, secured Macedonian dominance over Greece, and dreamed of conquering Persia. Alexander, raised in this environment, inherited not only power, but also purpose. The path toward empire had already been drawn. What remained was for Alexander to walk it with the energy and ambition that made him legendary. And so, as the shadows lengthen over Philip's reign, we drift toward the story of a young prince waiting in the wings, prepared to take up the mantle of leadership. The foundation is strong, the army ready, and the vision vast. The stage is set for Alexander's rise. As Philip II reshaped Macedonia and extended its influence across Greece, his young son Alexander grew under conditions that uniquely prepared him for leadership. Born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedonia, Alexander entered the world already marked by signs that later generations would interpret as omens of greatness. Ancient sources tell us that on the night of his birth, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned, and seers proclaimed this as a sign that something extraordinary was happening. While we cannot verify such tales, they reflect the sense that Alexander's arrival carried with it the weight of destiny. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was a strong and influential figure. A princess from Epirus, a neighboring region, she brought with her connections to powerful clans and religious traditions. Olympias was known for her intensity of character, her devotion to the god Dionysus, and her belief in divine destiny. From her, Alexander inherited both ambition and a sense of spiritual purpose. His father Philip, meanwhile, provided him with the practical example of rulership, strategy, and diplomacy. Between these two figures, one worldly and political, the other passionate and spiritual, Alexander grew into a complex character who blended ambition with vision. From an early age, Alexander showed intelligence and determination. Ancient anecdotes recount his taming of Bucephalus, a massive and spirited horse that no one else could ride. According to legend, the young prince observed that the animal was afraid of its own shadow, and by turning the horse toward the sun, he calmed it and mounted successfully. Philip, witnessing this, is said to have exclaimed that Macedonia was too small for Alexander, and that he must seek a kingdom worthy of his spirit. Whether the story is embellished or not, it captures the essence of Alexander's youth: keen observation, courage, and a determination to master challenges. Education played a crucial role in shaping him. Philip, determined to provide his son with the finest instruction, invited the philosopher Aristotle to serve as Alexander's tutor. Aristotle, already a towering figure in the intellectual world, established a school at Mysa, where Alexander and a group of noble youths studied under his guidance. Here, in the shaded groves and quiet halls, Alexander encountered the vast inheritance of Greek thought. Aristotle introduced him to philosophy, ethics, politics, and natural sciences. He taught him to analyze arguments, to question appearances, and to appreciate the pursuit of knowledge. The works of Homer were studied with care, and Aristotle encouraged Alexander to see Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, as a model of courage and honor. Indeed, Alexander carried a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, on his later campaigns. Beyond literature, Aristotle exposed him to geography, botany, and zoology, subjects that would later fuel Alexander's curiosity as he explored lands far beyond Greece. Yet Alexander's education was not confined to books and ideas. He trained in the arts of war, learning to ride, to hunt, and to command. He participated in hunts that tested endurance and courage, as nobles pursued lions, boars, and deer in the Macedonian countryside. These hunts were not mere sport, but training grounds for leadership, instilling discipline and skill in managing both animals and men. Military drills familiarized him with the phalanx and cavalry, preparing him to step into the role of commander when the time came. The environment of the Macedonian court also shaped Alexander. Feasting halls echoed with stories of ancestors and gods, with songs that praised heroes of old. Nobles debated politics and pledged loyalty, while rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Alexander grew up amidst this mixture of camaraderie and competition, learning to navigate relationships with both charm and determination. He saw firsthand the way power depended on persuasion as much as on force, a lesson he would carry into his career. Even as a teenager, Alexander demonstrated leadership. When Philip campaigned abroad, Alexander at times acted as regent, overseeing matters of the kingdom in his father's absence. On at least one occasion, he led troops into battle, proving his ability to command soldiers older than himself. His presence inspired loyalty, for he was not a distant royal, but one who shared hardships with his men. The bond between leader and army that would later define his campaigns had its beginnings in these youthful experiences. Alexander's character blended traits that sometimes stood in tension. He was fiercely ambitious, unwilling to accept limits. He sought recognition not only as a king, but also as a hero, even as a semi-divine figure. At the same time, he had genuine curiosity, desiring to understand the lands and peoples beyond Macedonia. He valued courage and despised cowardice, sometimes pushing himself and others beyond reasonable limits. These qualities, shaped in childhood and adolescence, prepared him for the extraordinary path ahead. We should also consider the quieter rhythms of his early life. Within the palace, Alexander would have heard the voices of poets and musicians, felt the solemnity of rituals to the gods, and observed the administration of justice by his father. The walls of Pella were adorned with art that reflected both Greek and Macedonian traditions, blending mythological scenes with depictions of everyday life. Outside the palace, fields stretched across the landscape, reminding even princes of the land's fertility and the dependence of rulers on farmers and workers. By the time Alexander reached his late teens, he had been prepared in every sense. His body was trained for endurance, his mind sharpened by philosophy, his ambitions fueled by heroic models, and his political instincts shaped by courtly intrigue. He had seen his father conquer enemies and unite Greece under Macedonian leadership. The stage was set, and when the time came, Alexander was ready not merely to inherit a kingdom, but to pursue greatness beyond its borders. As we let this chapter close, we imagine Alexander as a youth standing at the threshold of destiny, gazing beyond Macedonia's mountains, his mind filled with Homer's verses and Aristotle's teachings, his spirit restless for challenges greater than any his homeland could offer. The young prince is ready to become a king. The death of Philip II in 336 BCE was sudden and violent, and it thrust the young Alexander into power with breathtaking speed. The assassination took place at Aige, the old Macedonian capital, during a grand celebration, the wedding of Philip's daughter Cleopatra. As Philip entered the theater, dressed in his finery and surrounded by nobles, one of his bodyguards, Pausanias, rushed forward and struck him down. The king, who had built Macedonia into the strongest power in Greece, fell before his people, his plans unfinished. In the confusion that followed, danger surrounded Alexander. At only 20 years old, he now stood at the center of a storm. Succession in monarchies was rarely secure, and Macedonia was no exception. Rivals within the royal family could claim the throne, and external enemies were always ready to exploit uncertainty. Yet Alexander acted swiftly, demonstrating both decisiveness and the resolve that would mark his reign. His first task was to secure his claim at home. Olympias, his mother, played a crucial role in removing potential rivals. Sources tell us she arranged the deaths of Philip's new wife Cleopatra and her infant daughter, ensuring that no alternative heirs could challenge Alexander. Though these actions may seem ruthless, they reflected the harsh realities of dynastic politics in the ancient world. Alexander, meanwhile, asserted his authority by rallying the Macedonian army and gaining their recognition as king. The loyalty of the soldiers, already impressed by his past leadership, proved decisive. Beyond Macedonia, the Greek city-states watched closely. Many of them had resented Macedonian dominance under Philip, and now, sensing weakness, they stirred to rebellion. In Athens, orators debated whether Philip's death was a chance to restore independence. In Thebes, resistance began to grow. Across Greece, murmurs of revolt reached Alexander's ears. To secure his father's legacy, he needed not only to claim the throne, but also to demonstrate his power swiftly. Alexander moved with remarkable energy. He marched south into Greece, confronting city after city with either diplomacy or force. His presence was enough to quiet some, but in Thebes, rebellion broke into open defiance. In 335 BCE, Alexander led his army against the city. The result was shocking. Thebes was stormed and destroyed, its walls torn down, and its citizens enslaved. This act, though harsh, sent an unmistakable message. Alexander would not tolerate rebellion. Athens and other cities, alarmed by Thebes' fate, quickly submitted to Macedonian authority. Greece was once again under firm control. With the homeland secured, Alexander turned to the larger vision inherited from Philip, the campaign against Persia. The Persian Empire, vast and wealthy, stretched from Asia Minor to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to India. Though weakened by internal struggles, it remained formidable, and to the Greeks it symbolized both an ancient enemy and a grand prize. Philip had already begun preparations for invasion, gathering forces under the banner of the League of Corinth. Now Alexander took command of this coalition, presenting himself not only as king of Macedonia, but also as the leader of all Greece in a war of revenge and liberation. Before departing, Alexander ensured stability in Macedonia. He left Antipater, one of his most trusted generals, to govern in his absence. He also settled matters with neighboring tribes, campaigning swiftly along the Danube and into Thrace to secure the northern borders. These expeditions displayed his energy and skill, convincing both allies and enemies that he was not a mere youth, but a capable ruler. The crossing into Asia would soon follow, but in these first years of his reign, Alexander demonstrated qualities that would define him: boldness, decisiveness, and a capacity to inspire loyalty. He did not hesitate in the face of danger. Instead, he seized the moment, turning threats into opportunities. His destruction of Thebes, though remembered with sorrow by later generations, showed his determination to hold Greece together, no matter the cost. His swift campaigns against tribes in the north displayed his tireless energy, and his assumption of the Greek cause against Persia showed that he was more than a Macedonian king. He was the heir to a wider vision of conquest. Within the palaces of Pella, preparations must have been intense. Armories filled with weapons, ships ready to transport soldiers across the Hellespont, and messengers traveled between cities to ensure supplies. The atmosphere blended excitement with anxiety. For the Macedonians, this was more than a military expedition. It was the chance to step beyond their homeland and into the pages of history. Soldiers trained, feasted, and made offerings to the gods, while families prepared to part with sons and husbands who might never return. We should not forget the human dimension of these events. Behind the grand movements of kings and armies lay countless lives shaped by decisions at the highest level. Farmers continued to tend fields, women wove cloth and raised children, artisans crafted goods, and priests offered prayers. The rhythms of daily life continued even as the storm of conquest gathered on the horizon. In many ways, this was the paradox of history, the extraordinary and the ordinary existing side by side, one shaping the other. As we let this chapter settle in our minds, we can picture Alexander standing at the threshold of his destiny. He is no longer the student of Aristotle or the ambitious prince in his father's shadow. He is now the king, master of Macedonia, leader of Greece, and commander of a vision that stretches far beyond the Aegean. The campaigns into Asia are about to begin, but already the shape of greatness is visible. His rise to the throne has been sudden, his actions decisive, and his ambitions vast. The stage is set for the young conqueror to take his first steps across the ancient world. The year 334 BCE marked the beginning of Alexander's great expedition into Asia, a moment when the youthful king transformed his father's dream into reality. To cross from Europe into Asia was not merely a military maneuver, but also a symbolic act. It meant stepping into the world of legends, following in the footsteps of heroes like Achilles, whose deeds in the Iliad had inspired Alexander since childhood. It also meant confronting the Persian Empire, the greatest power of its time, and beginning a struggle that would reshape the ancient world. The crossing itself took place at the Hellespont, the narrow strait we now call the Dardanelles. Ancient sources tell us that Alexander paused here to honor the gods and heroes of old. He sacrificed at the tomb of Persepolis, the first Greek warrior said to have fallen at Troy, and he visited the ruins of Troy itself, where he paid tribute to Achilles, his hero. Standing on this soil, Alexander declared himself part of that epic tradition. To his men, it was a powerful gesture. They were not only soldiers embarking on a campaign, but heirs to a heroic struggle stretching back centuries. Alexander's army at the outset of the campaign numbered around 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, a relatively small force compared to the Persian resources. Yet what the Macedonians lacked in size, they made up in discipline, innovation, and leadership. The phalanx, with its long spears and precise formation, provided a nearly impenetrable front. The companion cavalry, led by Alexander himself, offered speed and decisive striking power. Alongside these, allied Greek contingents and mercenaries added variety and experience. The Persians, aware of the invasion, gathered their forces near the Granicus River in Asia Minor. Here, Alexander faced his first major test. The battle, fought in the spring of 334 BCE, was fierce. The Persians attempted to block the Macedonian advance at the river, using their cavalry as a wall of defense. Alexander, however, showed characteristic boldness. Leading a charge across the river, he engaged directly in combat, his helmet gleaming in the sun. At one point, he was nearly struck down, but a companion saved him by cutting down the Persian who raised his weapon against the young king. The Macedonians prevailed, and the Persian forces retreated, leaving the path into Asia open. The victory at the Granicus was more than a military success. It set the tone for the entire campaign. Alexander had shown his men that he was willing to fight alongside them, sharing their dangers and leading from the front. His courage inspired loyalty, while his tactical skill impressed allies and intimidated enemies. The Greeks of Asia Minor, long under Persian rule, began to see Alexander as a liberator. Cities like Sardis opened their gates to him, and he respected their traditions, presenting himself not as a conqueror who destroyed, but as a leader who restored freedom. As Alexander advanced along the coast, he ensured control of strategic harbors, for he understood the importance of securing supply lines and naval support. He captured key cities, reorganized their governments, and left behind garrisons to maintain order. His policy combined firmness with respect, allowing him to win allies as well as victories. Life on campaign brought both hardship and a sense of purpose. Soldiers marched across varied landscapes, from the fertile valleys of Anatolia to rugged hills and scorching plains. They carried with them memories of home, songs, and rituals, but also embraced the excitement of discovery. Markets followed the army, with merchants selling food, wine, and goods. Camps at night were filled with the hum of voices, the crackle of fires, and the clatter of armor being repaired. The bond among soldiers grew stronger, forged by shared struggle and the inspiring presence of their king. Alexander himself balanced military leadership with cultural gestures. He visited temples, offered sacrifices, and respected local traditions. At Ephesus, he entered the great temple of Artemis, recently rebuilt after a fire, and presented himself as a benefactor. By acknowledging the gods and customs of the lands he entered, Alexander cultivated goodwill, showing that his mission was not simply conquest, but a kind of integration into a broader Hellenic world. The Persian satraps, regional governors, struggled to mount effective resistance. Their empire was vast, but its communication slow, and rivalries among commanders hindered unity. Alexander exploited these weaknesses, moving swiftly, striking decisively, and always pressing forward. The speed of his campaign left enemies off balance and gave him the aura of an unstoppable force. Yet even in these early campaigns, Alexander revealed a restless ambition. Victories were not enough. He always looked to the next challenge, the next horizon. When his advisors suggested caution, reminding him of the dangers of overextension, Alexander pressed ahead. His energy seemed inexhaustible, his vision boundless. For him, the campaign was not simply about defeating Persia, but about creating a new order, a realm that blended Greek culture with the vastness of Asia. As the first year of campaigning came to a close, Alexander had secured a foothold in Asia Minor, won loyalty from Greek cities, and shown his men that their king was both brave and capable. The Persian Empire, though still immense, had suffered a blow to its prestige. A new force had entered its lands, led by a young king whose name was already spreading far and wide. As we drift away from this chapter, we picture the Macedonian army encamped under the stars of Asia Minor, their fires glowing in the night, their king among them, planning the next march. The sound of horses, the murmur of voices, and the distant call of owls fill the air. It is the beginning of a journey that will carry them across continents. A journey that began with a crossing at the Hellespont and a bold charge across the Granicus River. The path forward leads ever deeper into the heart of Persia. With Asia Minor secured after the Battle of the Granicus, Alexander now faced the greater challenge of confronting the full strength of the Persian Empire. The victory at the river had been decisive, but it was only the beginning. The Persian king, Darius III, now recognized the seriousness of the Macedonian threat, and he prepared to meet Alexander in open battle. The clash that followed would become one of the defining moments of antiquity, remembered for its scale, its drama, and its consequences. Alexander advanced steadily across Asia Minor, capturing key cities and ensuring that his supply lines remained intact. At Gordium, he encountered the famous Gordian knot, a complex knot tied to a chariot that, according to legend, could only be undone by the one destined to rule Asia. Alexander, unwilling to be confounded, drew his sword and cut through it. This gesture, whether legend or fact, captured his character, bold, impatient with obstacles, and determined to fulfill destiny by any means necessary. By 333 BCE, Alexander and Darius met near the town of Issus in the narrow coastal plain of southern Anatolia. The Persian army vastly outnumbered the Macedonians, with estimates placing it at well over 100,000 men, while Alexander commanded around 40,000. Yet numbers alone did not guarantee victory. The terrain at Issus, with mountains on one side and the sea on the other, limited the Persians' ability to deploy their full strength, turning their advantage into a constraint. The battle unfolded with intensity. Darius positioned himself at the center of his army, surrounded by guards and chariots, while Alexander led his cavalry on the right wing, aiming to strike where the Persian lines were weakest. The Macedonian phalanx advanced steadily, spears bristling like a living wall, while the cavalry prepared to deliver the decisive blow. At the critical moment, Alexander charged directly at the Persian center, aiming not just to break the line, but to reach Darius himself. The sight of the young king leading the charge, gleaming helmet and horse at full gallop, electrified his men. Panic spread among the Persians as their king fled the field, abandoning his army. The rout was devastating. Tens of thousands of Persians were killed or captured, while the Macedonians secured enormous spoils. Among the captives were Darius's wife, daughters, and mother, whom Alexander treated with remarkable respect, ensuring their safety and honoring their dignity. This victory at Issus sent shockwaves across the ancient world. Alexander had not only defeated a larger army, but had humbled the Persian king himself. The psychological impact was immense. Macedonians and Greeks saw their leader as nearly invincible, while Persian confidence faltered. Cities and satraps across the empire began to waver, some defecting to Alexander, others preparing to resist desperately. Yet Alexander did not rush blindly after Darius. Instead, he turned southward, recognizing the importance of controlling the eastern Mediterranean. The Persian fleet still posed a threat, supplied by coastal cities like Tyre and Sidon. To secure his rear and prevent counterattacks, Alexander embarked on a campaign along the coast. The siege of Tyre became one of the most famous episodes of this stage. Tyre, a wealthy Phoenician city, stood on an island just off the coast, its walls rising high above the sea. Confident in its defenses, Tyre resisted Alexander's demands to surrender. In response, he undertook the audacious task of building a causeway from the mainland to the island, hauling stones and timber to create a path for his siege engines. The work was grueling, attacked constantly by Tyrian ships, but Alexander persisted. After months of struggle, Macedonian forces breached the walls in 332 BCE and Tyre fell. The capture was brutal, with much of the population enslaved, yet the victory removed a key obstacle to Alexander's dominance of the Mediterranean coast. From there, Alexander marched into Egypt, where he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian rule. In Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, embracing Egyptian traditions and presenting himself as chosen by the gods. He founded a new city at the mouth of the Nile, Alexandria, which would grow into one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the ancient world. In the desert, he visited the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa, where priests hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon. This moment reinforced Alexander's sense of divine mission, blending Greek and Egyptian traditions into his identity. Meanwhile, Darius regrouped, raising yet another vast army. The stage was set for an even greater confrontation. In 331 BCE, at Gaugamela in Mesopotamia, the two forces clashed in a battle that would decide the fate of the Persian Empire. Once again, Darius's numbers dwarfed Alexander's, but once again, strategy and discipline prevailed. Alexander employed brilliant maneuvers to outflank the Persians, and when the decisive moment came, he charged directly at Darius's position. As at Issus, the Persian king fled, leaving his men in chaos. The victory at Gaugamela was final. With the Persian army shattered, Alexander marched into Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. From there, he continued into Susa and Persepolis, capitals of the Persian kings. Persepolis, with its grand palaces and halls, stood as a symbol of Persian majesty. After occupying it, Alexander allowed his men to loot its treasures. And in a moment that has long fascinated historians, he ordered parts of the palace complex burned, perhaps as an act of revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens long before, perhaps as a symbolic end to Persian dominance. By this stage, Alexander was no longer merely a Macedonian king. He was ruler of an empire that stretched from Greece to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to Persia. His soldiers, though weary, followed him with loyalty, inspired by his vision and by the sense that they were participants in a world-changing endeavor. As we close this chapter, we can picture Alexander standing among the columns of Persepolis, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and the glitter of treasures beyond measure. His path has carried him across rivers and deserts, through battles of astonishing scale, and into the heart of Persia itself. Yet for Alexander, this is not the end, but another beginning. His gaze turns ever eastward, toward lands still unknown, where new challenges and wonders await. Having secured victory over the Persian Empire, Alexander might have chosen to consolidate his rule, rest his armies, and govern the lands he had conquered. Yet such was not his nature. Restlessness and ambition carried him onward, deeper into new territories, where his identity as a conqueror began to intertwine with that of a ruler seeking divine sanction. His journey into Egypt in 332 BCE illustrates not only military strategy, but also a turning point in how Alexander perceived himself and how others began to see him. After the hard-won victory at Tyre, Alexander marched south into Egypt, where Persian satraps had long ruled. But unlike Tyre, Egypt offered little resistance. For centuries, the Egyptians had chafed under Persian rule, seeing their conquerors as outsiders who did not respect local traditions. When Alexander entered the land, he was welcomed as a liberator. In Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, assuming titles that linked him to the long line of ancient rulers. He offered sacrifices to the Egyptian gods, acknowledging their traditions in a way the Persians rarely had. Perhaps the most enduring act of his time in Egypt was the founding of the city of Alexandria, at the mouth of the Nile Delta. Alexander himself chose the site, appreciating its access to both the Mediterranean and the Nile, and he sketched out the plan for its streets and harbors. Though he would never live to see it flourish, Alexandria grew into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Its famous library and lighthouse, later constructed, became symbols of learning and exploration. Here we see Alexander not only as a conqueror, but also as a visionary city builder, planting seeds for generations to come. The Egyptian sojourn also brought Alexander into contact with the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa, a remote sanctuary deep in the desert. Determined to confirm his divine favor, Alexander led a small entourage across arid sands to reach the oasis. Ancient accounts describe how the priests there greeted him not merely as a king, but as the son of Zeus Ammon, a fusion of the Greek father of gods and the Egyptian deity associated with creation and kingship. What exactly was said in the sanctuary remains unclear. Sources are vague and perhaps colored by myth, but the effect was profound. Alexander emerged from Siwa with a heightened sense of destiny, convinced of his divine origin and mission. To his soldiers, this belief may have seemed strange, but to Alexander it offered legitimacy that transcended borders, binding together Greeks, Macedonians, and Egyptians under a shared vision of divine kingship. As Alexander left Egypt, he carried not only political authority, but also symbolic power. He was pharaoh to the Egyptians, liberator to the Greeks of Asia Minor, and conqueror of the Persians. His titles were multiplying, and so too were the expectations of those around him. Yet Alexander remained focused on the east, where Darius III had not yet been fully defeated. The Persian king still commanded loyalty in the heartlands of Mesopotamia, and so Alexander turned once more toward battle. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, where Alexander's army faced a Persian force many times its size. We have already noted its scale and decisive outcome, but what followed is equally important. After Gaugamela, Darius fled once more, only to be murdered by his own men as Alexander pursued him. In that moment, Alexander declared himself not only king of Macedonia and hegemon of Greece, but also king of kings, adopting the Persian royal title. He entered Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis as rightful ruler, presenting himself as the heir to both Greek and Persian traditions. In Babylon, he demonstrated magnanimity, restoring temples and honoring local gods. In Susa, he seized treasures of immense wealth, but he also embraced Persian court customs, wearing elements of their dress and incorporating their nobles into his administration. This policy of fusion was controversial. Many Macedonians grumbled at their king's adoption of Persian ways, but Alexander insisted on uniting East and West under his rule. The burning of Persepolis, however, stands in contrast. A symbolic act that some viewed as vengeance for Persian invasions of Greece in earlier centuries, while others saw it as a drunken impulse. Whatever the cause, the image of the grand palace engulfed in flames became a powerful marker of the end of Persia's old order. Daily life during this period reveals the shifting character of the empire Alexander was creating. In the palaces, Macedonian soldiers now mingled with Persian courtiers. Banquets included Greek wine and Persian delicacies, and music blended styles from different lands. In the cities, artisans adapted Greek techniques to local traditions, creating a hybrid style that later historians would call Hellenistic. Merchants found new opportunities as trade routes expanded, carrying goods from Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond. The empire was becoming a vast network of cultural exchange. For Alexander himself, Egypt and Persia represented more than conquest. They represented identity. He began to see himself not only as a Macedonian king, but as a universal ruler chosen by gods across cultures. This belief, while inspiring to many, also created tensions with his Macedonian companions, who feared he was moving too far from their traditions. Yet Alexander pressed forward, undeterred, convinced that his mission lay not in resting on laurels, but in seeking new horizons. As this chapter closes, we can imagine Alexander standing on the banks of the Nile, gazing at the foundations of Alexandria, or walking among the ruins of Persepolis, contemplating the weight of history. His path has taken him from Greece to Egypt to the heart of Persia, and his titles now stretch across continents. But for Alexander, the world was still vast, and his ambition still unquenched. His gaze turns eastward, toward the lands of Central Asia and the distant mysteries of India. By 330 BCE, Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire's heartlands, yet his ambition pressed him onward. Victory over Darius III and the capture of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis might have satisfied another ruler. For Alexander, however, the horizon always seemed to stretch further, and so he turned his gaze toward the east. His campaigns into Bactria, Sogdiana, and eventually India carried him far beyond the known world of most Greeks, into landscapes of mountains, rivers, deserts, and cultures that expanded the boundaries of his empire and imagination. The pursuit of Darius had ended in tragedy when the Persian king was betrayed and murdered by his own satrap, Bessus. When Alexander reached him, Darius was already dying, and Alexander, moved by the fallen king's fate, covered his body with his cloak and arranged for a royal burial. This act, both practical and symbolic, marked Alexander's claim to the Persian throne as heir rather than usurper. Yet Bessus's betrayal did not go unpunished. Declaring himself king in the eastern provinces, Bessus sparked new resistance, forcing Alexander into campaigns across Central Asia that tested his endurance more than any battle in Greece or Persia had. The regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, corresponding to modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, were difficult lands to subdue. Mountain fortresses, swift horsemen, and rugged terrain challenged Alexander's tactics. The Macedonian phalanx, so effective on plains, struggled in narrow valleys and against elusive enemies. The campaign stretched on, marked by long sieges, rapid pursuits, and harsh winters. At times, it must have seemed to Alexander's men that conquest had become endless, each victory giving way to another rebellion. Yet Alexander pressed forward with determination. He founded cities, often named Alexandria, to secure his conquests and to serve as centers of Greek culture and administration. These settlements, strategically placed along rivers and trade routes, acted as footholds of order in a landscape resistant to foreign rule. Soldiers, merchants, and settlers from Greece mingled with local populations, laying the foundation for cultural blending that would later define the Hellenistic world. It was during these years that Alexander's policies of integration became more pronounced. He adopted Persian dress on certain occasions, introduced Persian officials into his administration, and encouraged intermarriage between Macedonians and local elites. His own marriage to Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, symbolized this union of East and West. While many Macedonians resented these changes, fearing the loss of their identity, Alexander's vision stretched beyond national boundaries. He sought to create a unified empire that fused traditions rather than kept them apart. The campaigns eastward also revealed Alexander's restless curiosity. He studied the lands he entered, noting their plants, animals, and customs. He questioned local priests and philosophers, eager to expand his knowledge. When encountering the strange and unfamiliar, he did not turn away but sought to understand. This curiosity added another dimension to his conquests, for he was not simply a warrior, but also an explorer, mapping the edges of the known world. Eventually, Alexander turned toward India, crossing the Hindu Kush and descending into the fertile valleys of the Indus River. Here he encountered powerful kingdoms, rich cities, and armies equipped with war elephants, creatures unfamiliar to the Macedonians. At the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE, Alexander faced King Porus, whose elephants struck fear into the Macedonian ranks. Yet Alexander, with characteristic ingenuity, outmaneuvered his opponent by crossing the river under cover of night and striking unexpectedly. The battle was hard fought, with heavy losses, but Alexander prevailed. Impressed by Porus's bravery, he not only spared him, but restored his kingdom, making him an ally rather than a subject. The Indian campaign revealed both the brilliance and the limits of Alexander's ambition. His men, weary after years of marching through deserts, mountains, and endless battles, began to resist further advances. When Alexander proposed to press deeper into the subcontinent, his soldiers refused, longing to return home. Though disappointed, Alexander recognized the limits of their endurance. He turned back, leading his army down the Indus, facing new challenges as they navigated rivers, resisted local rebellions, and endured hardships on their return toward Persia. Life during these eastern campaigns was marked by both hardship and wonder. Soldiers marched under burning suns and through biting cold, their supplies often stretched thin. Yet they also encountered new foods, new animals, and new peoples, broadening their sense of the world. Markets in Alexander's camps grew diverse, offering goods from Greece, Persia, and India. Artisans carved objects that blended styles, and storytellers wove tales of lands beyond imagination. The army was no longer simply Macedonian. It had become a microcosm of the empire itself, diverse and dynamic. For Alexander, the journey eastward was more than conquest. It was a quest for knowledge, glory, and identity. He saw himself as surpassing the heroes of old, venturing further than Achilles, Heracles, or Dionysus. In doing so, he expanded not only the borders of his empire, but also the horizons of the ancient world. As we drift from this chapter, we can imagine Alexander standing by the banks of the Hydaspes, the rain-soaked battlefield behind him, the elephants still restless in their pens, and the exhausted army murmuring with relief at the decision to turn back. The land of India had tested their endurance and their resolve, but it had also revealed the vastness of the world and the boundless ambition of their king. The return from India marked the beginning of the final chapter in Alexander's life, a time of both triumph and strain, of grand plans and growing tensions, and ultimately of an untimely death that left the world transformed but unsettled. Having marched further east than any Greek or Macedonian leader before him, Alexander now turned his weary army back toward Persia. Yet though his men longed for home, Alexander remained restless, his vision still stretching toward horizons yet unconquered. The descent down the Indus River was arduous. Alexander's forces faced resistance from local tribes, whose fortified towns required difficult sieges. The Macedonian soldiers, already exhausted, endured hunger, heat, and constant skirmishes. At the fortress of Multan, Alexander himself was gravely wounded. Scaling the walls ahead of his men, he exposed himself to danger and an arrow pierced his lung. His troops, horrified, fought desperately to rescue him. For days, Alexander's life hung in the balance. When he finally appeared before his army, pale but alive, the relief was overwhelming. This episode, though it showed his reckless courage, also strained his men's loyalty, for they saw how their king's relentless drive endangered not only himself, but also them. From the Indus, Alexander divided his forces. Part of his army marched west through harsh deserts, while another traveled by sea under the command of Nearchus, exploring new routes along the Persian Gulf. The desert crossing proved devastating. Food and water ran short, and thousands perished under the relentless sun. Alexander himself shared in the suffering, refusing to drink when his men were thirsty, pouring precious water onto the ground rather than claim it for himself. Acts like this inspired loyalty, yet they could not erase the growing fatigue of a decade-long campaign. By the time the army reached Babylon in 323 BCE, Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to Egypt, from Persia to India. He had founded more than 20 cities, spread Greek culture across continents, and integrated diverse peoples into his administration. Yet rather than rest, he immediately began planning new expeditions. He dreamed of marching west to Arabia, perhaps even further, to explore the edges of the known world. His vision of empire seemed limitless, a fusion of conquest, exploration, and cultural blending. But beneath the surface, strains were growing. Many Macedonian soldiers resented Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, including the practice of proskynesis, a form of bowing that Greeks considered inappropriate for mortals. His encouragement of intermarriage between Macedonians and Persians, symbolized by the mass wedding at Susa, where thousands of his men were paired with Eastern brides, stirred resentment. While Alexander saw these unions as a way to bind his empire, many soldiers viewed them as betrayals of their traditions. Tensions also arose within his inner circle. Some companions who had marched with him since the beginning now found themselves marginalized as Persian nobles gained influence. Accusations of conspiracy, real or imagined, led to executions, leaving a sense of unease among those closest to him. Alexander's personality, once marked by charm and generosity, seemed increasingly consumed by intensity and suspicion, perhaps a reflection of the pressures of ruling such a vast and diverse realm. Despite these tensions, Alexander's charisma remained powerful. When mutiny erupted at Opis, where his men refused to follow his plans for further campaigns, he addressed them with fiery words. He reminded them of the victories they had shared, the riches they had won, and the glory they had achieved. At one point, he dismissed them, declaring that he would continue alone if necessary. Moved by his passion, the soldiers relented, reconciling with their king. It was a testament to the extraordinary bond between Alexander and his army, forged through years of shared hardship and triumph. In Babylon, Alexander turned his attention to governance and planning. He reorganized provinces, sent officials to survey lands, and commissioned ambitious construction projects. He sought to blend Greek and Eastern traditions, envisioning an empire where cultures coexisted under his rule. The city of Babylon itself became a symbol of this vision, a cosmopolitan hub filled with Macedonian officers, Persian nobles, Greek philosophers, and merchants from distant lands. Yet his life was nearing its end. In June of 323 BCE, after days of fever, Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32. The cause of his death remains a mystery. Some suggest malaria, others typhoid, and some even whisper of poisoning. What is certain is that his sudden passing left his empire without a clear successor. His only son was yet unborn, and his generals, the Diadochi, soon divided his vast realm into competing kingdoms. The unity Alexander had forged in life splintered in death, and yet his legacy endured. The cities he founded flourished, spreading Greek language, art, and philosophy across the Near East. Alexandria in Egypt became a beacon of learning, with its great library and lighthouse. Trade routes expanded, carrying goods and ideas between East and West. The blending of cultures, often called the Hellenistic Age, gave rise to new philosophies, religions, and sciences. From astronomy to medicine, from sculpture to literature, Alexander's world left a lasting imprint on human civilization. For the Macedonians who had marched with him, memories of hardship and glory mingled. They had crossed deserts, rivers, and mountains. They had fought under blazing suns and freezing winds. They had seen elephants on battlefields and temples rising from foreign sands. They had followed their king to the ends of the earth, and in doing so, they had changed history forever. As we let this story draw to its close, we may picture Alexander one final time, not as the conqueror at Gaugamela or the visionary at Alexandria, but as a man standing quietly under the stars of Babylon, gazing at the heavens. His empire, vast and fragile, stretched around him. His dreams, larger still, reached into eternity. Though his life was brief, his impact was immeasurable. The world he left was different from the one he inherited, and his name would echo through the ages, inspiring poets, generals, and dreamers alike. And now, as the narrative settles like soft dusk, we may allow ourselves to drift into rest, carrying with us the gentle memory of a king who sought the horizon, and in doing so, reshaped the world.